Today we're going to be using the quadratic formula to solve quadratic equations. The quadratic format is a times x squared plus bx plus c. That is to say, you have a group of three terms with a variable that is squared, and the coefficient in front of that variable is called a. You have the same variable with an exponent of 1, which of course we don't write, and the coefficient of that term is b. The last term is a unit with no variable attached to it, and we call that c. Now a quadratic equation would be the same thing, except that the three terms equal 0. Now there are three ways to solve for a quadratic equation. The first method that we learned was by factoring. The second method we learned last lesson, which is solving by completing the square. And the third method that we're learning today is by using the quadratic formula. Now this is a quadratic formula and you are required to memorize it. It's a little complicated, but like you saw in the last lesson, there are certain quadratic equations that cannot be solved by factoring, so there are other methods that we use. Aside from memorizing this, it's probably the easiest method to use if factoring does not work. And the equation, as you can see, is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and all of that over 2a. And then for the most part, we're going to have two answers. So up here we have a very simple quadratic equation, and here we have the quadratic formula. Now I suggest you start like this, and then it's going to be a lot simpler to insert the proper numbers. Because I can guarantee you a real common mistake is you see negative b and you want to insert the value for a. Don't do that. Okay, the value for b is positive 3, which means negative b is going to be negative 3. There you go, and I like to start at the beginning and work my way from left to right, just like we're reading. And b squared is going to be, what, 3 squared, which would be 9. And that's going to be minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 2. And on the bottom we have 2a. A is the coefficient for x squared. The coefficient for x squared is 1. We've already gone over that right here. Remember there was an a there too. So we're going to have 2 times 1. And I'm not going to write 2 times 1. I'm just going to erase that a so that you know that the bottom number is going to be 2. Good. And the next calculation that we're going to make is, well, 3 squared was 9, so we already did that. 4 times 1 times 2 is 8, so we have the square root of 9 minus 8. 9 minus 8 is 1, and the square root of 1 is 1. So we have negative 3 plus or minus 1, all of that over 2. And that's what x equals. And so to make life easy on ourselves, why don't we write this twice? Once for the plus and once for the minus. Did you see that? Hopefully you did. Negative 3 plus 1 on the top here. We have negative 3 minus 1 on the top here. Remember what we had? We had 3 plus or minus 1. So now we have plus or minus, and we've divided it. And as you can see, this is a pretty good place to divide it. You don't want to do that from the very beginning and do all this work twice. But now that we're pretty much at the end of our calculations, that's going to work really well. Negative 3 plus 1 is negative 2 over 1, and negative 2 over 1 is negative 1. And so that is our first answer. And down below we have negative 3 minus 1 is negative 4 over 2. Negative 4 over 2 is negative 2. And you can write it like this. Mr. Wallace likes to write x equals -1 or -2. And this is the way I like to write it. X equals parentheses -1 comma -2. And if you're thinking, well, the second number in a parentheses is y. No, that only applies if you have y in the equation. So you can write it like this, and this means x equals either one of those numbers. Now, let's try another problem. And we got two problems here. One is we want all of our numbers on the left-hand side of the equation. And we've done that before, so that shouldn't be a big deal. Let's do that. And our other problem is that there is a coefficient in front of x squared. We have not learned how to deal with that yet. It is no problem with the quadratic formula because the coefficient in front of x squared is a. So where we were inserting 1 before, we can insert 25. So that's not that big of a deal. And there are ways to solve this with the factoring, solve by factoring, but that's not going to work if you end up with an answer like we're going to end up. We're going to end up with an answer, spoiler alert, we're going to end up with an answer with the square root in it, and like we discussed last time, solving by factoring is not helpful when you have crazy numbers like that. But anyway, all we have to do, did you hear a little bit of an S after that? Anyway, I was almost going to say anyways. But anyways, there you go. Let's put up the quadratic formula. It's really going to be helpful. A lot of books don't do this. Mr. Wallace doesn't do this, but every time I do this, I write the quadratic formula, and then it's just real easy. And what do I have for b? It's not 30, it's what? -30. And what are we supposed to put here? -b. So -30, which is +30, right? And the square root of b squared, and b again is -30, and c is -11. And you better put that -11 in parentheses, or you're going to be subtracting that instead of multiplying it like you should. Be very careful about that. And 2a, a is 25. And there we've substituted in all of our values, and our 30, we don't need to do anything there, plus or minus the square root of 30 squared. What's 30 squared? It's 900. And by the way, I cheated a little bit. I said 30 squared, and it's really -30 squared, but it's the same result. 30 times 30 is 900, +900. -30 times -30 is 900. And I probably shouldn't have done that, but anyway, I went back and explained what I did, so I guess that's okay. And let's see. We have 4 times 25 times -11, and that's -1100. Now watch your signs. We had a negative sign right here, and we had another negative sign right here. Remember -11? So a negative times a negative is going to be what? It is going to be positive, positive, or positive. And 900 and 1100 is 2,000, the square root of 2,000. And we're going to take off 2 sets of zeros. Remember that? When we have these numbers with enormous zeros behind them. And this isn't enormous, but there's 2 extra there that we can remove. And that'll give us 10 root 20. I hope you remember how we did that before. If you don't, go back and watch that video. Anyway, we can break down 20 a little bit more. 2 times 2 times 5, grab the twins and take them out. And we have 20 root 5, and that's as much as we can simplify that. Down on the bottom, we have 2 times 25, and that is 50. And let's see. If we divide 50 by 10, We can divide 20 by 10, and we can divide 30 by 10, so we can divide everything by 10. And remember, when we divide everything by 10, we don't divide this. We just, because this is 20 times root 5, so we don't need to divide that by 10. When you're multiplying things, and I believe we went through that before, when we're multiplying two terms, we only divide one of the numbers by the whatever we're dividing the denominator by. And so 50 is going to become 5, 30 is going to become 3, and 20 is going to become 2. And our answer is going to be 3 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 5, all of that over 5. And maybe I should have put x equals that. And I can write that twice. You know, some books require that you write it twice, most don't. And so I could write this twice like we did before, 3 plus 2 times the square root of 5 over 5, and or 3 minus 2 times the square root of 5 over 5. But you can see that that symbol there, plus or minus, helps you out as far as not having to write all this twice. That is the answer. And remember, when you see plus or minus, just know that we have two answers until you get rid of that plus or minus like we did last time. Let's do another problem. Okay, if you're following along in the book, this is example 468. And I skipped the first part of this because what we have is a bunch of x squares on one side of the equal sign and a bunch of x squares on the other side, a bunch of, just a lot of stuff that we've done before. So we're just going to skip that part of it, and we're going to come down to about the third line where they put everything on the proper side of the equal sign, including the 0. And so we have this in the format. We're always trying to get in the format of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And we are in that format now. And that's really all we need. And instead of doing this one by one, we're going to throw everything in here right now. And remember, before we do that b is a negative number, so we're going to end up with a positive number here. Okay, and let's run through that real quick. This is negative 2, which is positive 2. This is negative 2 squared, which is we're squaring the 2 and the negative. Don't forget that. So negative 2 squared is positive 4. Minus 4 times the coefficient of x squared is 1. And c equals 13. And so the first thing we're going to do is multiply 4 times 1 times 13. And that is 52. That might be easy to remember if you're familiar with the deck of cards. A deck of cards has 52 cards, and the reason for that is because you have 13 different numbers, and kings and queens and all that. And we have 4 different suits, so 4 times 13 is 52. And we have a problem, don't we? What's 4 minus 52? Well, guess what? It doesn't even matter what it is. It's 48, but it doesn't even matter. It's negative 48, and you cannot have a negative root. Again, just so you're not confused, next year or in 2 years when you take Algebra 2, you can have negative roots in Algebra 2, and we are not going to get into it. It's actually, we are going to get into it. It's called the imaginary number. You want to know why they call it the imaginary number? Because it's imaginary. There's no such thing. So anyway, as far as Algebra 1 is concerned, there is no solution to this. Let's try something else. There you go. We have 4x squared minus 12x plus 9 equals 0. So why don't we take a, b, and c. A is 4, b is negative 12, and c is 9, and insert them into our formula. Okay, negative 12 is positive 12, and negative 12 squared. I didn't put the negative there again. You can if you want. Probably should, but it's going to be the same result. Minus 4 times 9. Now let's multiply the 12 squared out. Let's multiply the negative 12 squared out. And that's 144, and 4 times 9 is 144. And that's interesting. 144 minus 144 is 0. The square root of 0 is 0. So we are going to have 12 plus or minus 0. Well, what's plus 0? 12. What's minus 0? 12. So no matter what we do, we're just going to have a 12 up there. So for this answer, we're not going to have a plus or minus, which means what? We're only going to have one answer. And on the bottom we have 2 times 4, which is 8. 12 over 8 reduces to 3 over 2, and that is our answer. We only have one answer for this. And by the way, maybe you aren't interested, but the reason why we only have one answer for this is because this is a square. And so if you take that original equation and you kind of square it out, you'll see that it's, I think it's 2x minus 3. Is that right? 2x minus 3 in parentheses squared equals 0. And but whatever it is, it's a square, and any square is only going to have one answer, and that's the reason why it only has one answer. You're going to get that sometimes, not too often, but if you see that you have a square root of 0 plus or minus the square root of 0, just know that that's what's going on there. And of course, always check your work, because any crazy thing can be going on if you don't insert your numbers right. You insert A where B should be. You insert B and don't leave it negative, or we have a negative B in this, and so we started off with a negative B, which makes it positive. I mean, just check your work for little things like that, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong in the quadratic formula, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong when working with quadratics, as we've seen. You know, we're getting toward the end of Algebra 1, and so we're getting into some really difficult stuff. And to tell you one more thing, and you know what it is, do your homework.